warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Today, we talk about Ukraine and the prospects for a peaceful settlement of the crisis. Is there room for negotiations in compromise? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Marcus Papadopolous. He's publisher and editor of Politics First. We also have Sarah Lain, a research fellow at the Royal United Service Institute. Also, Christopher Walker. He's a former bureau chief of the Times in Moscow. And sitting next to me here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio, I have Mark Sleboda. He is a senior researcher and lecturer at Moscow State University. Okay, Marcus, if I can go to you first. We have a deadline coming up, the 27th, for this so-called ceasefire to develop into something. What is its prospects? Where is this going?
Well, at the moment, the prospects, they look very bleak indeed. Since the initial ceasefire was called last week, the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian militias, made up of some very disturbing groups, including neo-Nazi groups and neo-fascist groups, they haven't ceased their operations in the east of the country. And of course, that is already jeopardizing any talk of a ceasefire. And I am very, very concerned because I do fear that a Pandora's box has been opened in Ukraine since the overthrow of the democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. And it's important to note that Ukraine, it's not like Britain, it's not like France, it's not like Germany. It's a very fragile country. Its borders were artificially drawn up by the Bolsheviks. There was very little interest in independence. All you have to do is go to the March 1991 referendum when over 70% of Ukrainians voted to preserve the Soviet Union. And so we're in a situation today whereby there's so much blood that has been spilt in the East, men, women and children, which of course is not being reported by Western media, unsurprisingly, and they're doing so for political reasons. But it's very difficult to see how, with so much blood having been spilt and such a terrible conflict having emerged in such a, relatively speaking, short period of time, how peace can now come to eastern Ukraine. And we've heard how Poroshenko has said that the Ukrainian language will always be the sole language of Ukraine. That's hardly appropriate words to use at such a sensitive time for the country.
Sarah, where is this ceasefire talk coming from? Because Poroshenko says he wants to have a ceasefire, but it seems so unilateral. We have, on the other hand, Vladimir Putin here in Russia asked the Federation Council to revoke the War Powers Act to give him the authority to intervene in Ukraine. That's gotten so little airtime in Western media, I'm really quite astounded, or maybe I shouldn't be. So where is this ceasefire talk coming from? Is it coming from pressure from the outside, and I'm thinking about Angela Merkel, Hollande, and other players, or is it just looking for time to continue this assault on the East?
Well, I think there is a genuine desire for the conflict to cease in Ukraine, and I think Poroshenko he did issue the ceasefire. It did stipulate in his 15-point plan that it catered to disarmament. It did say that decentralization and more autonomy for the eastern regions was on the cards. It did say that protecting the Russian languages were important, but a huge limitation was the fact that it didn't stipulate for negotiations. And the recognition from eastern Ukraine of the ceasefire came after talks between the separatists and the OSCE and former Ukrainian President Kuchma. So I think that's been a
Russian ambassador.
Russian ambassador in Ukraine. So I think that was a huge limitation. I mean, the ceasefire is meaningless without people sitting down and talking about a real solution to the problem.
Christopher, it's very interesting that Poroshenko sent Kuchma, the second president of independent Ukraine, to these talks, and very informal. I mean, they don't even want to put any kind of officiality to it here. Is Poroshenko just playing a game here, or is he afraid of the Maidan? Is he afraid of people like Right Sector if he makes too many moves, too many overtures?
Yes, I think he is. I must say I'm slightly more optimistic than my two colleagues here, because having seen in my life, I think, more ceasefires over the world, and I've had hot dinners, as you could see if you were on telly. I've had plenty of those. I just felt here some little raise. I mean, there's always a breakdown. I know you're going to have an idiot shooting down a helicopter like you had this week, but in the greater shape of things, and it's terrible for the families and terrible, from a point of view, but not strategically perhaps the most enormous event. tweet, whereas I think Putin actually getting up and making that speech. I also slightly disagree with you about the airtime. I know it was third lead on the BBC, and it's got to compete with phone hacking on an industrial scale, where every single journalist in England seems to be listening to the phone of the other one. I mean, news is hot at the moment. Iraq is hot. Syria is hot. It's the way of the world that these, I call them 24-hour news cycle crises, have a sort of 2 week...
but Christopher, I can jump in here and go to Mark. I mean, but the civil war goes on here. It seems to me, and Mark and I usually agree on most things. We're diverging over the last couple of weeks on the issue of Ukraine. This has to be settled by Ukrainians, Mark, right?
No, I don't think it does.
Third week.
First of all, you're correct. This ceasefire is a quite cynical, agreed-upon fiction at this point. There is no ceasefire on the ground. The Western media does have a complete blackout on what's been going on in the eastern Ukraine, not only over the recent months, but particularly within the last week. The artillery shelling has never stopped. Just last night, another woman was killed because of the nonstop artillery shelling. Within hours of announcing the ceasefire last week, there were airstrikes on another city. And yesterday we saw the provocation where a Ukrainian military helicopter was flown into rebel-controlled territory and, yes, was shot down, showing that neither side is upholding the ceasefire. There is no ceasefire. It is a fiction that is only being agreed upon for diplomatic reasons at this point. As to whether this can be solved by Ukrainians, no, because at the geopolitical, there's many different ways to analyze this situation. It is certainly at the local level a conflict between Eastern Ukrainians and Western Ukrainians over their conception of a nation and the Ukrainian state. But at the geopolitical level, this is in the end a confrontation between the West, and particularly the United States, although Europe certainly plays the role as junior partners, and Russia at a global stage. The whole conflict about the Ukraine is not about the Ukraine. The West doesn't care about the Ukraine or the Ukrainians at all. It is certainly no prize to be won for either side economically, but the entire goal of what is happening in the Ukraine is to prevent the formation of the Eurasian Union, and by denying Ukraine to that Eurasian Union, it limits its geopolitical range and scope. Hillary Clinton has made clear previously that the United States will do everything possible, and this is what they have done.
Marcus, let's go back to Putin's announcement asking the Federation Council to withdraw those war powers. He's taken a lot of heat here in Russia for doing that. I would agree with Mark that, Ukraine is some kind of geopolitical chess game for people in Washington, but Ukraine is a local issue in Russia.
Oh, absolutely. What Bavaria is to the rest of Germany, Ukraine is to Russia. This is not some foreign land. This is not some obscure country. Millions upon millions of people in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, they're either ethnic Russians or they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians who still look to Moscow as their mother country. And of course, Vladimir Putin, he is under a lot of pressure because thankfully, we have Russian media that has been covering the terrible conflict in the east of the country in depth, and we've seen how electricity has been cut off on numerous occasions, water supplies has been cut off on numerous occasions, men, women, and children. You don't see the BBC showing footage of dead children which have been caused by Ukrainian army mortaring, but that's been shown in Russia, and there's a lot of Russians that have connections to Ukraine, not just the east and the south, but also in Kiev as well. And of course, President Putin's statements yesterday about withdrawing the right to militarily intervene in Ukraine would not have gone down well with a lot of Russians. But of course, Vladimir Putin is trying his best to try and diffuse the conflict there. However, I don't want to come across as being pessimistic, but let's be frank about this. American and European interest in Ukraine is not guided by democracy or human rights. If that was the case, they wouldn't have such a close strategic relationship to Saudi Arabia. What it's all about is about tearing away Ukraine from Russia, bringing it into the West orbit, and enclosing Russia on its western borders. Now, unless Ukraine adopts federalization and unless the government in Kiev states clearly it will never join NATO, and NATO also says it will never seek membership for Ukraine, this ceasefire, even if it materializes in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, there will be a crisis in Ukraine. Again, it doesn't matter if it's 10 years, 15, 20 years, unless the United States government stops attempting to try and bring in as many countries into NATO in order to weaken Russia, there will always be a crisis. It's going to happen again in Ukraine. We had Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, a couple of weeks ago say that the door will always remain open to Georgia. And that's on the back of the war in South Ossetia 6 years ago.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Sarah, one of the interesting things when Putin asked the Federation Council to withdraw those war power rights, there's always been lurking in the back of the mind of policymakers here in Moscow is that if there were a military intervention into eastern Ukraine, there would be some Ukrainians that would interpret that as an occupation. And I think that's been a worrying thought here. But let me turn the coin on the other side, is the longer this conflict goes on, the more the people in the East will feel like they're being besieged and occupied as well.
Well, I think this is part of the issue is that, it's very much seen in zero-sum terms. So Western Europe acts in one way, NATO acts in one way. Therefore, it's a negative for Ukraine or a negative for Russia and what that means in the region. And I think, yes, of course, there is an ethnic divide and there is a lot of history in terms of Ukraine being part of Russia. But the fact is that it's an independent country now and there are international laws and, of course, people can circumvent them and they can break them. But if things are going to be resolved peacefully, there has to be some form of negotiation and rules.
Well, Sarah, if I can jump in here, I'm a real stickler for one point here, is that we had that agreement in February, and it was overturned by the use of arms and force and violence and Molotov cocktail bombs. If I can go to Christopher, they had a deal in the beginning of this year that was workable for all players. And the European Union signed off on it. There was a Russian witness that signed off on it. Didn't sign the piece of paper, I want to be clear on that. But we had something going. And it's been downhill ever since because of the perception of the kind of regime that is in Kiev.
Yes, I mean, that is, God, it does seem an awfully long time in the past, doesn't it? But we did. I mean, it started off with an agreement. I seem to remember us saying it around that time the EU couldn't agree on itself, and it still can't agree on itself, and it's still fighting over who its next leader's going to be. So don't bank too heavily on them. But I do think there is just this wisp of hope that in a world that since those days elsewhere has got drastically worse. When we're going back to those February days, cast your mind wider than Ukraine and the other neighbouring places, and things have got immeasurably worse. And one just does hold a sort of feeling that a man like Putin, and I go along with the view of your friend in Moscow that this is not going to be sorted by Ukrainians. Similarly to the Northern Ireland problem was not solved by Irish people. They have to go along with the big plan that the bongo drum beaters impose on them, but they don't come up with it on the whole because they're too intractably opposed to each other. But I don't think Putin is intractably opposed to the West.
I think far from it. I think that Vladimir Putin has made more concessions than he's given credit for. Mark, at the end of this week, Poroshenko says he's going to sign the association agreement, the economic part of the association agreement with the European Union. Now, when that happens, before the ink is dried on that document, Russia will start lifting tariffs on a number of Ukrainian goods, important export markets for Ukraine. And this is we'll see the economy continue to spiral downward.
Yeah, this is where the whole crisis gets a little surreal, is that in its complete ignorance with this regime that has come to power in Kiev and its Western backers that helped bring it to power, that the economic realities dictate that a Ukraine as an independent, viable state is impossible without at least equitable friendly relations with Russia. Russia is almost the entirety of the Ukraine's source of energy. Russia is the Ukraine's largest trade partner. Last year, Ukrainian trade with Russia was larger than Ukrainian trade with every single country in the European Union. And this holds particularly true, of course, in the East, where the conflict is centered, the industrial and most developed part of the Ukraine. Russia and the Ukraine already have a free trade agreement. The Commonwealth of Independence Free Trade Agreement was signed in recent years, and it has been in effect, and it has seen dramatic increases in cross-border trade between Russia and the Ukraine.
But when Ukraine signs the association agreement, then it's a different ballgame.
When the Ukraine signs this, what can only really effectively be described as a neoliberal shock therapy suicide pact, reminiscent but on steroids of what was inflicted on Greece by Germany. Russia will automatically have to.
Wait, let's be clear here, because it has to do that.
It has to. This is and the EU Barroso has admitted as much. There is no compatibility between these free trade areas. Russia will automatically have to enact tariffs and close down a lot of cross-border traffic, and this will devastate the Ukrainian economy, in particular the East. And further, there are several million Ukrainians working
here
in Russia, and their remittances are no small part of the Ukrainian economy. This is, in the long term, this Ukraine, with the regime that exists in Kiev, is economically and politically, both domestically and internationally, unviable. The only question remains is how many people, both Eastern Ukrainians and Ukrainians that do support this putsch regime, have to die before they come to this realization.
On that point, I completely agree with you. Marcus, I agree with Mark on everything he just said about the economy here. And again, a little bit of history. Russia proposed a trilateral commission, the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia, to avoid what Mark just described. Because when those tariffs go up, we're going to go into the long game. And I think this is what Russia's plan is. It doesn't have as much influence in Ukraine as people think. Far from it. But in the long term, Russia is going to be a witness to watching this country go into a spiral downward economically. And of course, its social and political implications are obvious.
Absolutely. Russia has every right to protect its economy, something which doesn't appear to be recognised or accepted in Washington or Brussels. But as you say, that will be another reason why, even if there is a ceasefire, and if it materialises into a permanent ceasefire, we're going to be back at the table. We're going to be back discussing where do we go from here? Because, of course, if Ukraine does sign that association agreement with the EU...
It will.
Okay, let's assume it will. That could have catastrophic consequences for the southern regions and in particular the eastern regions of Ukraine, which are wholly dependent on trade with Russia. So I think it's a matter of the Americans and the Europeans, they're playing a zero game, and it's a matter of it's our way or the highway. And they are very confident now because, of course, they now have their man in Kiev. Before, when President Yanukovych chose to pursue closer economic relations with Russia, that wasn't accepted in the West. But now they have Poroshenko. It's perfectly acceptable for him to sign an agreement with the European Union. And of course, the question is this: what if all of a sudden there were huge protests in Ukraine against Poroshenko and they became violent? And if Russian politicians flew into, say, Donetsk and started calling for the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, exactly what happened at the beginning of this year against Yanukovych with politicians like John McCain, what would be the response of the West then? They wouldn't like it.
Oh, that's an understatement there. Victoria Nuland would be not passing out cookies, that's for sure. Sarah, let's talk about the hard realities of this. It is a titanic shift when we look about the economy here. Here's an economy that's already very weak, even before all of this started. And when that agreement is going to be signed, and Poroshenko has made it clear he will sign it, to what advantage is that to Ukraine?
Well, I think a point that has been missed in this is that, yes, Russia has the right to protect itself economically with tariffs, but it's not as if Russia has sat back and watched the whole conflict in Ukraine unfold. It certainly has had, possibly, overstated at times by Western media, but it has had direct involvement in the events in Ukraine. So I think if Russia had potentially used its very strong power and very strong influence in the country, and particularly eastern Ukraine, it could have potentially helped avoid it get to a point where Ukraine once again is economy is
Well,
suffering.
can you give me an example of what Russia could have done or shouldn't have done? Where's one example?
It was called to use its influence to try and talk to the separatists in eastern Ukraine and try and bring them back from the brink of this active militant activity. It also has just turned off the gas to Ukraine, which you can put down to economic terms.
Turned off the gas.
What interest does Russia have in accepting the results of a Western-backed, Western-supported, Western-orchestrated, Western-funded regime change against a democratically elected, legitimate government in Kiev as a fait accompli?
But that
Why
has
would they
nothing to
accept
do
that?
with supplying it with gas.
It has everything to do with it. It has everything to do with
If
it.
Ukraine wants to have normal relations with Russia, pay the market price. Normal relations means no favours, no discounts. Therefore, you pay that market price. If you don't pay it, then you don't receive gas.
Yeah,
Yes,
sort of
but-
deal I like, I'll tell you what price I'm willing to pay, and now you jolly well give me what I want. It's not going to work like that. It is the outstanding issue. I think in some way the elephant in the room is the gas question. And it may be in the longer term, or the medium long term, that a solution some way or other to the gas problem will lead to the wider strategic problem rather than the wider strategic problem leading to a solution to the gas problem. Gas is all, and winter is approaching.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Sarah, going back to the gas issue, this is something that has always been a problem between Russia and Ukraine. And it doesn't matter which government is in power, by the way. It doesn't matter who's president. They've always had to haggle over this. And even the European Union, their energy commissioner, said that what Russia was proposing, Russia's Gazprom, was a good deal.
I understand that, and that's true, but I think there are direct correlations between changes in political power in Ukraine and the price and supply of gas from Russia. For example, after Yanukovych turned away from the EU agreement, suddenly there was a massive discount in the gas price that Russia was supplying to Ukraine. Then Yanukovych fled, it increased significantly, and now Russia is negotiating. It is saying, $3.85 is a fair market price, but Ukraine's issue is that is based on a $100 discount. That can be, it's not contractual. So next time Russia isn't particularly happy with political activities in Ukraine, it will go up to $4.85, and that's higher than any European price for gas.
Fair enough. But Marcus, one of the things that I think is interesting is during this week here, we had a flurry of diplomatic telephone calls. We had Putin and Merkel. We had Poroshenko talking to Merkel in Hollande in France. I mean, the Europeans, they see the winter coming. They see the chaos that is still playing out in Ukraine. They're getting a little nervous now.
Very quickly, can I just say President Yanukovych did not, quote, flee Kiev. He was actually ousted. But of course, the Europeans, now they see the writing on the wall that winter is not that far away. And of course, if Russia does intend to refuse to send gas to Ukraine because it's not paying its bills, then of course that's going to have a direct effect on the rest of Europe. So the Europeans have got to take that into consideration, and they've got to talk to Russia in a respectful and meaningful way, and stop demonizing Russia and stop talking to it in a condescending way. Russia has an integral right to have a say in Ukraine, and they have to accept that.
Christopher, when I was a child and my mother used to take me with her shopping, she always told me that, if you go into a shop and you pick something up and you break it, she'll have to pay for it. Has the European Union and the United States broken Ukraine? If they have...
By the way, a very wise woman, your mother. But I think we've got to look to another pointer slightly outside, the thing, which is that the British Guardian has been made an enormous amount of the fact that Mr. Putin likes the chocolate that the president is making, and they see that as perhaps the pointer of the way that those two men can, in the great Thatcher phrase, do business. And that might be part of the long-term deal. Not chocolate, but business.
No, Christopher, you're absolutely right. And we've heard this from the very, very beginning, is that these two men could talk to each other. And Poroshenko at least
They have
had,
talked
I don't know
to
if he
each
still,
other, haven't they?
No, to do business. And this is one of the things, if I can turn to Mark right here, we go back to the days of February, and we have, looking at it from Russia's point of view, the European Union lied. They walked away from a brokered agreement. And this is this distrust that is built up when we look at relations between a broken Ukraine, that I would say, and the European Union vis-a-vis Russia.
Well, I wouldn't say that Europe lied and they walked away from the agreement. They just were completely powerless, as was, it should be said, the three supposed opposition
Well, they recognized
leaders.
the coup outcome the next day.
They recognized the outcome. That is a different story. The facts on the ground is that despite attempts in the Western media and by many Western analysts to play down and whitewash the political nature of the players that have the real power in the Ukraine at this point, and did on the streets of Kiev during the riots and continue now, are a particular, and including in the Rada, are a number of extreme ultranationalists and what can only be described as fascists, as the European Union Parliament itself expressed just over a year and a half ago a condemnation of the Sleboda party for its ultranationalism, xenophobia, and suggested that no democratic player should ever ally with it. And it is these forces, in particular the right sector and all of the ultranationalists and fascist groups associated with it, that broke the 21st agreement. It was the facts on the ground that dictated the Geneva Agreement. Again, it's the facts on the ground with these ultranationalists and now this oligarch, feudal Baron Kolomoisky, who has always been one of the funders of them, that no ceasefire is in effect because these people will never stop until they have the current head of the SBU, just a few years ago, was at a paramilitary camp, and he said that Ukraine would never be an independent country until the ideology of Stefan Bandera, the genocidal Nazi collaborator, was accepted as the ideology of all Ukraine. And that's the current head of the SBU. And with these array of forces, you can never have any kind of agreement that will stand.
Well, let's create some facts on the ground. Marcus, I think when we look at the ceasefire, the 15 points, which I don't see how anyone in the East could accept that ceasefire agreement, but there could have been one point, a simple point, is that all of the regions elect their own governors. You could organize that election in 2 weeks, I bet you. And then you have a roundtable agreement with all of the regions talking to the president, and you start a talk about federalization. A little naive, I agree. But this would have been constructive, something like that, asking people what they actually think.
Certainly, but then federalisation doesn't suit Washington and it doesn't suit Brussels. Both capitals, they want the whole of Ukraine to enter into an economic agreement with the European Union. And let's also remember there's another side to this as well. The Americans are acutely aware that there are parts of Ukraine which are very important to the Russian military and nuclear sectors as well. Let's not forget that there are factories in Kharkov which make engines for Russian helicopters, Nikolaev, spare parts for the Russian Navy, Dnipropetrovsk, elements for ICBMs. Now, if those companies were to come under a European Union banner, so to speak, what's to say in a few years' time those factories couldn't become privately owned by a European company or American company? And what would happen then if they were to stop supplying those parts to the Russian military? That would weaken the Russian military, and I think that's something that's not being picked up on in this debate, and that's why the Russians. Another reason why Russia is so concerned about this.
If I could jump in there, I have to say that there is a divergence of the interests of the Russian Federation and the people, governments, and self-defense fighters of Novorossiya at this point, in that it is in Russia's interests to have a federated Ukraine. It is no longer within the interests or the desire of the people, including, I have family in the region, of the people of Novorossiya to have a federated Ukraine. That ship has come and gone. They have no interest in a federated Ukraine. They have no interest in remaining part of the Ukraine.
Then, Mark, how is this going to be resolved? I mean, a civil war forever?
It already is a civil war. They don't want it. They don't want to be part of a country that has labeled them terrorists and has been trying to exterminate them into submission for the past 3 months.
Okay,
They don't want
we're
it
rapidly
anymore.
running out of time. Sarah, if you could give some advice to the Russian government and to the Ukrainian government, what would it be?
Well, I think dialogue has to be opened, like meaningful, proper dialogue. I think the Ukrainian government has been very slow to come to the table on this, and I think a ceasefire is a good idea. It is encouraging peace, but it has to have some substance behind it, and it has to be observed. And there was still fighting over the weekend, but that's partly because Eastern Ukrainian separatists didn't accept it until Monday evening. To Russia, I think I would advise to use their power, and I would agree that sometimes Russia is not seen in the power that it is and the seriousness with which it should be taken as a geopolitical partner. But Russia should use that to try and diffuse this situation.
I want to thank my guests here, Marcus, Sarah, Christopher, and Mark here sitting with me in Voice of Russia's studio in Moscow. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with Voice of Russia.